Hello, everybody. I am Daniel Aaron, your host for The Art of Vibrant Living, and I am very happy that we have Dr. Will Tuttle with us today. Early thanks to Longevity Drops, our sponsor, and let's just jump right into it. It's such a blessing to have you here today. Dr. Tuttle is a really accomplished, broad spectrum, I'd say artist, really, artist of life. And how I first came into contact with Will is I read his book many years ago, The World Peace Diet. And for a long time, my own teachings around yoga and what I do with my trainings and in my own lifestyle is about how can I live more peace in the world. And when I came across that book and it became a great part of the curriculum for our training, I just so appreciated the message of that. And then was lucky enough to be, I think it was on Maui a couple of years ago, and Will and I met in person there, and Will's going to be coming and part of our teacher training in May, bringing us some information and education. And in addition to being the author of that book, which was, I think, over 10 years ago now, Will's got two other books we'll hear about today. He's an accomplished musician, a former monk, and a really fascinating, heartful guy. Will, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone for listening in and watching, and I'm really delighted to be with you, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. It's fantastic.
It's a real blessing for us to be here, especially with David. This is, David Wolf's channel, and he's a good friend. And the people that are here are people who are for sure interested in the relationship between food and health. And, and I know for you, Will, that's a big part of it. And you talk about the different levels of health. But before we jump into really helping people make the link and make it more conscious. And I definitely want to get into how people can look at and understand their food choices and the effect that has on them and on the world. For you and I, this kind of conversation, veganism, and the way our food impacts the greater whole is a normal conversation. I know that for myself and for you, though, it wasn't always that way. And I grew up in the standard American diet world and eating meat 3 times a day and never thought anything about it. And you did in a way too. Would you be up for telling people how you got to be where you are now with this?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Daniel. I'm very similar to you. I was born and raised back in the 1950s in New England, in Concord, Massachusetts, eating the typical meals of lots of meat, dairy, and eggs, and fish, and so forth. And I did not question it because there was no little chink in the wall anywhere for any vegetarian or vegan light to shine in back then. And so, in fact, I remember when I was about 7, I asked my mother, so the food we're eating, is that what everybody eats in the world? And she said, yeah, this is pretty much what everybody eats. And then she came back a few minutes later and she said, well, actually, that's not true. There are vegetarians. And I had never heard that word. And I was at that age when I loved learning new words, especially if they were big words. And I said, what's a vegetarian? And she said, well, I wouldn't worry about it. You're never going to meet one. And she said, I'm a lot older than you are, and I've never met one. And then she said, I don't know where they get their protein. So I had this image of these poor people who were vegetarians that were probably dragging themselves along the ground, barely able to walk because they didn't, they were suffering from such severe protein deficiency. And I was so glad I wasn't a vegetarian and that we could eat meat and be strong and healthy and get plenty of protein and get plenty of calcium from the milk and so forth. And so that was my life growing up. And I went away to a summer camp when I was in my early teens, maybe 13, 14 years old, and participated actually in killing chickens and cows on this dairy operation. That was sort of learning where your food comes from. And I have to say, I didn't like doing it, but I was sure that what I was doing was the right thing, because like you, at that point, I had gone through about 13 years of the most intense indoctrination a person can go through. And I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that God gave us these animals to eat. They don't have a soul. They taste good. And if you don't eat them, you're definitely going to die within 24 hours of a protein deficiency. So that was basically it for me. And so I remember, we shot this poor cow in the head right in the barn, in this cute little Vermont dairy where nothing bad ever happens, a little organic, small operation. The dairyman himself, shot the cow, and we helped cut the cow up. He said, if you can't use it for meat, you have to use it for milk. You have to use it for meat. And so that was the thing. And what I'm so glad really in my story is that when I went away to college back in the early 70s, I began to realize that there were people who were vegetarians, but I never actually met one, like my mother said. But right after that, I left home with my brother. We decided to go on a spiritual pilgrimage. I started reading books about Eastern meditation and yoga, and I was starting to practice yoga. I was starting to practice meditation. It was kind of the new thing back in the 70s. And I remember we thought we were going to go to California. We're going to go to San Francisco and find cosmic consciousness. That's back in the day when you could, have those kind of ideas and just do it. And so we left home. We walked down our parents' driveway. I remember we had some fresh baked cookies from my mother, and we left home and we're going to go and find enlightenment. And we got as far as Buffalo after a few weeks or maybe a month of walking. And then we decided to just head south, and we actually walked all the way down through upstate New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, into Tennessee, eventually to a Zen center in Alabama. But in Tennessee, we lived for a little while in a community that was called The Farm. And The Farm back in 1975, when I got there, was about 900 people, and they were mainly from California. So we felt like we kind of met everybody in the middle there. And but they were all vegetarians. They said, we're vegetarians. So this is my first real exposure to a community of vegetarians. There was 900 vegetarians. They were actually what we would call today vegans, in the sense that they didn't eat meat or dairy or eggs, but no one heard of the word vegan in 1975. So they said, we're vegetarians. And lo and behold, nobody was dragging themselves through the dirt, suffering of a protein deficiency. In fact, they struck me as being wonderful, energetic, creative, idealistic, very happy people, well-adjusted from my point of view. And so that was basically it. From that point on, I never have eaten meat in my life. Since 1975, I asked them, why are you guys vegetarian? And they told me that there were two main reasons. One was the fact that most of the food that we grow, instead of feeding it to the people who are hungry, like 80%, is fed to imprisoned cows, pigs, chickens, and other animals, fishes, and so forth. And so people are starving. And so what they said was, we want to create a world of peace. And it's well understood that food shortages are the main driving force behind conflict and war in the world. So we want to help create a more peaceful world. So we're eating lower on the food chain, so there's enough for everyone to eat. That basic idea. So I thought that was brilliant, actually. And then also, I remember the guy said, you know what the animals go through that people are eating. And I said, don't tell me. I don't want to hear all the terrible things. But he told me just a few of the things, the basic routine mutilations and castrations and impregnations and this whole, and the hyper confinement, the basic misery that we force all these animals into. And then the thought of eating all that misery too and causing it. But the beautiful thing for me was that I had this living example. I think it's kind of rare. I was with 900 other people. They were all vegans and they were all thriving. They had probably 200 children. They were all vegan from birth. They were doing great. So that was it. I never ate meat again. And actually, the other thing that was interesting, a couple of years, maybe I'd say 5 years later, 1980, I made the connection with dairy and eggs. So I became a vegan in the sense I gave that up. And it's kind of a process. I gave up leather and fur, wool, silk, all that stuff. I just try to kind of slowly get those things out of my life because I didn't like the idea of causing suffering to animals. I've always felt that the earth is so beautiful with such a celebration of life here, and the idea of imprisoning animals and abusing them just never sat well with me. And once I realized it's not necessary, and I had that example of another community, that made it so much more easy for me to do it, actually. It was that I realized basically one of the main teachings for me is that the only reason anyone eats animal foods is because of the communities we're raised in. So if we can have an example of an alternative community that's based more on health, sustainability, freedom, liberation, and equality and justice, then we can make a change. And that was what happened to me. And then the other thing, just briefly, is that a few years later, 1984, I shaved my head and I became a Zen monk. I was in Korea. I was already living in meditation centers in California at that point. I did get out there eventually for about 10 years. But when I went to Korea, I found myself in a Zen monastery called Songwangsa, which at that time, 1984, was totally vegan. I mean, it still is. We were just there actually recently. So there was no meat, no dairy, no eggs, wool, silk, leather. You wouldn't even kill mosquitoes. It was this idea we were meditating. Virtually, that was all we did from 3 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. Every day we were sitting. It was this intensive retreat. But I realized that I was in a community that had been practicing, again, what we would call today veganism for about 750 years, since I think the 1100s or something. This is what they had done for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that was a big piece for me to really understand that this thing we call veganism is not really veganism. It's an ancient practice. It goes back hundreds of years, probably thousands of years. And it's just I think really what it is, it's our natural wisdom, our natural intuition, our natural empathy and kindness just functioning naturally. When we see beings, we see beings. We don't see objects. We don't see commodities. And I think we're trained. We have our natural wisdom repressed, being raised in our society. And when that's, in a sense, a possibility, I think, for us to deepen our connection spiritually with our own inner wisdom, then we can begin to question the official narrative in our society. And then we can begin to actually, I think, be a force for healing in the world. So when I came back, actually, from Songwangsa, it was then that I went on to get my PhD at Berkeley and do a bunch of other stuff, including writing the World Peace Diet. And it became really my mission to help show people that there's a much bigger picture to the whole food thing. There's many levels of health, and to try to share this message as best I can, and working with my wonderful spouse Madeline in order to do that. So we travel a lot, but it's great to be able to work with people like you and the people who are watching and listening, because I think really this is the most important thing we can focus on today, is how to question a narrative that's harming us on every level, and the fact that we have an alternative that's absolutely practicable. So we're not just criticizing a system that's obsolete and destructive. We have an alternative that's delicious and that's available. So that's my brief story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And it's fun to hear your trajectory of how you came into the new awareness and seeing the living examples of it, and seeing the impact. And and I know you talk about the disconnection that's one of the ramifications of the meat diet. And and I know for me as a kid, I had no awareness of animals being the thing that was on my dinner plate. And I loved animals. And I'm curious what you can tell us about the reception. And I'm sure that a lot of our audience here, maybe most of our audience, are people that are already tuned into the impact of what they're eating in terms of their own health and also the greater planet. My experience when I made the connection, and it was when I was 17 years old, my first year of college, just suddenly a light went on and I realized, like, whoa, and it was, for me, it was a funny thing. I walked into Fuddruckers, this chain restaurant, and there was a big paper mache cow hanging from the ceiling, and I looked at it. No, it was plastic, not paper mache. And I looked at it, and the way they had it, one side it was black and white, shaped like a cow, and the other side it was a cross section, and it was showing the different cuts of meat, and this was advertising for them. And when I looked at it, I just stood there like open mouthed, looking up at, like, whoa, that's the animal that I love, and that's the thing that we eat. And that was the moment for me. I didn't eat any more meat, and I swung the other way, and I got into PETA, and I got into my college organization and for vegetarianism, and I started protesting and making paper mache cows, and I stopped just short of throwing blood onto people and that kind of thing. And what I found is that I started losing friends. I would walk into the dining hall and sit down for a meal, and people would leave the table. They're like, "Oh, there's that guy again. He's going to start criticizing what I'm eating." And I realized, like, well, this is not working. So I just cut it all off, and I stopped talking about it at all and didn't say anything to anybody. And then it was years later when I really understood the philosophy of yoga and ahimsa, non-harming or doing as little harm as possible. Then I realized, well, actually, this is part of the curriculum. This is part of the training. This is part of this pathway, and it's in a lot of traditions for if you want to awaken or you want to be happy, these are things that you can do. So then I started teaching about it again, and it became an important part of the curriculum that I share with people. And I know that you are teaching and sharing in a lot of parts of the world, and including in China a lot lately. So what can you tell us about the reception? And I know you're a gentle man who is really there to empower people, and you're not telling people what they should do or criticizing anything that they're doing. But what's the reception that you're finding for the World Peace Diet?
Yeah, wow, that's a fascinating story, Daniel. And I know, the first probably 10 years of being a vegan, a vegetarian and vegan both, but especially as a vegan, I was quite often in people's faces about it. Because I feel, even now, I feel that there is an obligation to be a voice for those who don't really have a voice in our society and who are being abused. And I don't want to stand by and just not say something when others are being harmed. The question, of course, is when we're in such a small minority, and people don't have to listen to us, they can say, well, I enjoy bacon, so the heck with it, to be effective. How do we actually be effective? And I think that's where yoga, meditation, spiritual practice, and honesty, I think, and integrity really begin to work together. And we can see, essentially, for me, the basic thing is, in terms of the receptivity to the message, is to broaden the discussion, so that instead of this old-fashioned way of doing something, which is, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm a vegan, you're not a vegan. I'm more evolved than you because I'm not causing suffering. Therefore, you're obviously less evolved, and because you are causing suffering, or you are causing pollution, and this whole kind of implicit judgment and criticism and shaming, really, of other people. And even if we don't say anything like that, even if I just say, well, I'm a vegan, people already feel like, oh God, he judged me right now. It can happen. It can be very polarizing, because the thing is, people don't freely choose to eat animal-based foods. No one freely chooses to eat these foods. We only do it because from the time of little infants, we're participating in rituals. And it's very important, I think. So this is what I basically talk about. I talk about the cultural programming or indoctrination and conditioning that we all go through, and show that whether we're vegans or vegetarians or omnivores or wherever we are on the spectrum, that we're all in the same boat, basically. We've all been wounded by being raised in a culture that is based on herding animals. So I invented a word basically called herderism, which is the mentality that is endemic or inherent in a culture that's organized around herding animals. And we don't think of ourselves as living in a herding culture, because we think those cultures were long ago far away when people were out with animals all the time. But we have just simply industrialized it, and we do it on a larger scale than ever. It's massive. I mean, the number of animals that we're killing every day, just for example, say in the United States, 75 million is a very conservative estimate. It takes an enormous industrialized killing machine to do that every day, routinely and relentlessly. And it only happens because we have a population of people who have been raised in a culture where they've been taught to demand these foods. If people stopped demanding these foods, it would stop completely, instantly. So we're born into a herding culture, an industrialized herding culture. We're forced from the time we're little kids by very well-meaning people, our parents, teachers, neighbors, religious leaders and so forth, government officials and so forth. They're all basically, I think, well-meaning. They want us to eat, the foods that are going to be healthy for us, but they've also been indoctrinated. And this goes back, as I discuss and show and demonstrate, actually, in the World Peace Diet. It goes back about 10,000 years when people first started owning animals as property for food. The word for that is herding. And the herding cultures have certain characteristics. They tend to be patriarchal because it's about not just humans dominating animals, but really more specifically, it's about men dominating female animals, impregnating them against their will, stealing their babies. And so there's this basic teaching of repressing the sacred feminine dimension of consciousness and of life, and of seeing females as just objects to be used. And I think when we're raised in that society, whether we're females or males, we're harmed enormously by that kind of underlying violence that's going on all the time, that we're paying for. But we're not just paying for it and causing it, we're actually eating it, right? It becomes the very cells of the body that we're using. So this herding of animals, I think the main point that I've discovered and that I share with people, and I think it's very effective because it's the truth. I love Gandhi's teaching, where he basically said, you don't try to change other people. All you can change is one person, yourself. If I can bring myself into alignment with these teachings in a deep way, then by how I speak, and it's not so much what we say, I think it's how we say it. And even more than that, it's who we are when we say it. It's who is the being that's actually speaking. And I think when we're embodying what veganism is, which is, as you said, ahimsa, or non-harmfulness. Another word for that, I think, is respect. Another word is kindness, gentleness, I think tenderness, mercy. These words essentially are pointing at a quality of consciousness that is available to us, but that is repressed by being raised in a society where ritualistically, every single day, like you said, probably 3 times a day, we're eating the flesh and secretions of animals who have been abused physically, psychologically, in every possible way. And we have to understand that every culture does this. Every culture transmits its values from generation to generation. That's what cultures do. It's not like we don't have to blame our culture. Cultures do that. They do it through rituals. The main ritual in any society is the meals of that culture. When people sit down and eat food, we're not just eating food, we're eating a whole series of attitudes that go in, and it's invisible, and it's we don't even know it. It just happens. But these attitudes that go in at a deep level, like I said earlier, the domination and repression of the sacred feminine dimension, and the creating a culture that's based on seeing animals, other living beings, as objects, imprisoning them. It gave rise also, for the very first time, actually on planet Earth, to a wealthy elite class that owned capital. The old ancient Latin word capita means head, as in head of sheep and goats, head of stock, livestock. So we have this arising of a culture based on the domination of most of the society by a wealthy elite class, the kings. I used to teach college courses in these ancient texts, like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad, the Odyssey, these ancient writings. And you can just read them. These kings are in power. They're controlling most of the institutions in the society. They're rich and powerful because they own animals. They're eating a lot of meat, and that has status. This is what we see. And we're in that same culture today. It's come through the generations, and also they invented 2 other institutions that we still have with us. One is war. The ancient Sanskrit word "go," which means cow, gives rise to this word gavya, which means war. It means the desire for more cows. That's war, the ancient word. So war came from this, and all the violence of war, the horror of war, and slavery, because whoever lost the war in those ancient times, the animals became the property of the victors, but so did the people. So we had this whole transformation, a very slow transformation of a more peaceful, I think, more aware society, at least a society where animals were treated with respect, to a patriarchal, violent, and really in many ways bellicose society, or whole tribes that were like this. And these people began to dominate and exploit and overthrow others, and this thing spread basically. And we can see how it spread through from the Eastern Mediterranean region into Central Asia, Northern Mediterranean to Europe, to North and South America. It's spreading really as we speak through the Kentucky Fried Chicken, Burger King, ConAgra, Cargill, Monsanto, this whole web of corporations and financial institutions and governmental agencies that are all part of that same herding culture and the mentality of domination and violence. So for me, if just explaining that, I'm not blaming anyone. It's like, for whatever reason, 10,000 years ago in what is today Iraq, people thought they had to imprison animals and confine them and then eat them and then eat their dairy products later and so forth. That's okay. I mean, if they had to do that, whatever. But why are we doing it now? It's obviously completely dysfunctional. It takes enormous quantities of land and water and petroleum, causes ridiculous amounts of pollution, climate destabilization, cutting down of rainforests, destruction of oceans. We get foods that are absolutely toxic to us. They concentrate toxins. We have heavy metals, PCBs, dioxins, nuclear radiation, all concentrating in these foods, plus the acidification, the inflammatory quality of animal proteins, the saturated fat, cholesterol. I mean, all this stuff. It's like, what in the world are we thinking? If we were actually logical, rational people, we wouldn't have to talk about it. We would all be vegan a long time ago. The thing is, we're not really logical and rational. We're much more tribal in the sense we just want to be like everybody else. We don't want to be different from the people around us, and we have a certain image of ourselves, and that gets very deeply ingrained into us. And we trust our parents at such a deep level. So when people hear these ideas, it creates an opening in them very often, but then there's the cognitive dissonance. And I think that's why it's important for us as activists to be kind and loving to people, because if people are wounded, and they are wounded, we're all wounded, it's not going to help them to then criticize them and kick them, while they're down. The whole idea is to be loving and show, gosh, I discovered, this is the basic idea, I discovered that the only reason I was eating animal foods all those years was because I was just following orders. And then I realized these orders are not in my best interest. I'm not doing it anymore, and it's fantastic. Now, that basic message, I think, is really the truth. That's Satyagraha, what Gandhi said. I'm just speaking my own truth. I'm sharing that truth with kindness and respect. And I have to say, Daniel, we've been able to go to places like the cornfield, small cities and towns in Iowa and Oklahoma, and share this message in local libraries with people who are definitely not vegetarian or vegan, and no one argues. I mean, because it's just that no one argues. It's true. I mean, everyone knows that the only reason anyone eats animal foods is because we're following orders. We're products of our communities. We do know it's really not in our best interest, health-wise, environmentally wise. We understand that. So there's really nothing to argue about. It's just basically sharing these ideas and with a loving way, and then planting those seeds. And like the Bhagavad Gita says, don't be attached to the fruit of your actions. Basically just plant the seed, let go, and then trust that people at a deeper level will wake up and that their intuition and wisdom is functioning. And I think that's what we're doing. Like what we're doing right now is just sharing our ideas. But we can't change anybody. People, when they come to this change on their own, then they're motivated, and then they're activated, and they're I think much more able to then be effective in their own way at sharing and being part of the solution.
Yeah, well said. Well, now that you've said all of that, I wonder, would you say, is there any downside to eating meat for us?
Any downside to eating meat?
I'm just joking. I mean, that was such,
right.
And I know that you were just touching really on very briefly, and, to hear the way you speak so eloquently and succinctly about it, it's just there, as you said, there's nothing to debate. There's just so many reasons why it's crazy that we would eat meat, and there's so many different angles and perspectives. And for me, I stopped eating meat because I got the connection that ethically it didn't make sense. I love animals and I love beings, and it doesn't make sense to participate in killing them. And then when I discovered, oh, hey, there are health benefits. Oh, and actually it's, beneficial for the environment. Like, oh, great. That's a really good bonus. And there's two areas that I want to jump into with you about this. One is what our food choices have to do with our intuitive and psychic abilities. And also, and this, I think these two are related, where it goes in terms of creating peace on the planet. We're at such an interesting time in our planet's history where there is more division and animosity than we've ever had before, which for me, and for what we're doing on the yoga teacher training is great news, because it means that yoga is still growing for some reason. We have an army of people that are trained to address this division and conflict in the world, and those are yoga teachers. But before we come to that, I want to just take a moment to thank our sponsor, Longevity Drops. And Longevity Drops is it's such a simple, easy thing that we can do to benefit our health. And I know for me, when I became vegetarian, I was a junk food vegetarian in the beginning. I had no idea about nutrition,
Right.
and I ate Kraft macaroni and cheese every meal, and I thought that was being a healthy person. And then as I started to learn about nutrition, then I got to discover super nutrition, and that's really what herbal medicine is all about. And part of what I love about this is in just a little bottle, and the way I do it, and it's so easy, is use a dropper full of this in the morning and the evening, and it's just power-packed essence and tonic herbs like chaga and romania and cordyceps and hoshu wu, and blended in coconut glycerin in a really high-quality way. It's eating vegetarian is fantastic because it will take away a lot of the toxicity that comes to us in other ways. And then when we have the ability to supplement with such beneficial things as tonic herbs, it's just a blessing for us. And before I turn over back to you, Will, to respond to what I'm saying, if you would, I want to let people know about what we're doing on the teacher training in May at Omega Institute. And I think part of what I want to say about this is, I hear people say a lot of times, like, I can't really do yoga because I'm stiff, or I haven't really done that before, which is kind of like saying, I'm too out of shape to go to the gym. Well, and the idea is, hey, this is the place we go in order to create this. And I'm really excited for myself, having been in Bali for the last 13 years and back in the US, to be partnering with Omega Institute and have so many amazing teachers like yourself part of what we're doing, to take people who, maybe are already teaching yoga, or maybe just a little bit interested in yoga, and have 26 immersive days to really get into the essence of what yoga is from all perspectives, from the physical practice, of course, but also the education and the philosophy, and maybe most importantly, the community. And you've addressed this already in beautiful ways here, that we tend to do what we see around us. We tend to be what we see around us. So the blessing of coming together for a month with like-minded people who are devoted to not just being peaceful, not just being healthy, but being lights in the world. And and just like you said, what Gandhi said, what we can do is change ourselves. We can be that change. And the more of us that are doing that, the bigger the impact in the greater world. And I really think that's why, that's why we've got such a crazy time on the planet right now. And that's why the political world has shifted into such craziness and ridiculousness, is to wake us up to say, you know what, it's time for those of us who believe in peace, those of us who believe in yoga, and there's so many people that are practicing yoga, to actually step up and really be leaders for a change in the world right now. And
Yeah.
I personally have this faith, and a lot of people would say it's crazy given the evidence that we have in the world right now. I have a faith that we actually can have a world where there is not war, where there is peace everywhere. And I have a faith that that we can all wake up to the idea that animals are beings worthy of love and respect, just like our brothers and sisters and parents and children. And and I know that these are very interrelated possibilities. So all that said, you know, what can you say about this connection between intuition and food and peace and the possibility for a whole new way of being in the
Yeah,
world?
thank you. Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, I think there's so many things you said that I agree. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. And I think the fact that you're going to be able to do an immersive intensive at Omega is terrific. There's something in all the world religions and wisdom traditions. It's called I would say right. You know, there's the Eightfold Path of the Buddha that has right livelihood and right speech, right thought, and right meditation, and so forth. But one of them that I think is sort of underlies all of those is right association. That whoever we associate with, we become like them. And I think it's important really for us to choose our friends and colleagues and partners and so forth very carefully, and to take advantage of opportunities to get together with like-minded people who share ideals that we want to grow and deepen in ourselves. And I think that kind of opportunity is incredibly important and powerful. And I think that's really, in a sense, what we're doing right now is creating a community at this moment, you know, for sort of a virtual community where we're sharing about ideas. And I think these are the kinds of communities that can transform the dysfunctionality of the community that we're born into. And I'm really glad that you brought up the idea of intuition and also world peace. Of course, I wrote the World Peace Diet. I've written another book that just came out called Your Inner Islands, The Keys to Intuitive Living. And this is something that I just can't estimate more strongly, which is that we all have an inner wisdom that is present all the time. And in many ways, I think it's been covered over by being raised in a society that's based on herding animals. It's based also on reducing people in many ways to commodities, to all of us to fit into a machine that's running here, an economic machine or a cultural machine. And so one of the things I talk about is the fact that there are 5 dimensions of health that we are, I think, very advised to become aware of. And when we think of being healthy, most of us think of our physical health, our biological health, our having a healthy body. And that's one. 4 other ones. And the underlying idea is that animal agriculture, or herding animals and eating the foods of these animals, is devastating and eroding and harmful to all 5 levels of health. We really need, I think, it's important for us to be very clear about this, that animal-based foods do not help us on any of these 5 dimensions of health. So what are these 5 dimensions of health? Besides the physical health, there's 3 of them really that are the outer world. So there's our physical health, our physical body. There's also our environmental health, the health of our earth. And then there's also a cultural health, or the health of our society. Those are the 3 outer dimensions of health. And I think we all know that they're all interrelated and all very important. It's really virtually impossible for us to be radiantly healthy physically if the environment is all messed up, right? If the water is polluted and the soil is eroded and the food is all contaminated and the air is, you know, and the climate and the oceans are being destroyed and so forth, all of this erodes the health of ecosystems that we depend on for our physical health. So we have to really understand clearly that animal agriculture is by far the number one most devastating activity that human beings engage in terms of environmental destruction. I could talk for a long time about it, and I've already mentioned a few things, but I recommend see the movie Cowspiracy if you have a chance, or just do some research. But basically, all the levels of environmental devastation, mainly because animal agriculture is so wasteful. It takes enormous quantities. A very conservative estimate is 10 to 1. There are 10 times the amount of land to feed one person eating a standard American diet as feeding one person, as feeding 10 people a plant-based diet, especially if it's organic. So we can really this is such a good news. I mean, the basic idea in all this is good news, really good news. We can really drastically and dramatically heal our world environmentally as we move toward a plant-based way of eating. The amount of land that we'll need to have destroy. We're cutting down rainforests right now at an acre per second in the Amazon. We can't even wrap our minds around what it is to cut down an acre per second of ancient forest and destroy habitat and cause the mass extinction of between 1 and 200 is the estimate of species every single day. It's going extinct because of cutting down and destroying habitat to grow soybeans to feed to imprisoned cows, pigs, chickens, and imprisoned fishes eat enormous amount of soybeans. So this soy production to feed animals, to fatten up animals, to get dairy products and meat and eggs, is driven by people taking out their wallets and voting for eating meat, eating these foods. That's the voting booth. And so it's very important, I think, for us to realize that environmentally, our oceans are being destroyed, our rainforests are being destroyed, our climate and soil and aquifers are being sucked dry. We see evidence of this. We lived in an RV for 17 years, traveling around all over North America, and now we travel worldwide, and it's clear. We just got back from Africa not too long ago. I mean, the absolute slaughter of elephants and zebras and giraffes and all these animals, lions, is because Kentucky Fried Chicken and Burger King and so forth are moving to Africa, and they need to grow a lot more soybeans and corn to feed these imprisoned animals. And now these free-living wild animals, these iconic animals, are now pests. They're now, get rid of them. That's the basic mentality we have in the United States. And in the West in general, we have governmental institutions and agencies that kill millions of coyotes and bobcats every year. So it's a war. Animal agriculture is a war against wildlife, a war against environmental health. Moving to a plant-based diet is by far the best thing anyone can do for environmental health, but also for cultural health, because we have to understand again that a healthy society is a society of justice, of equality, of caring and kindness, and animal agriculture is the exact opposite of these things. We're feeding enormous quantities of grain and petroleum and water to a relatively wealthy elite, those who live in industrialized nations where it's relatively easy for us with our high-powered economies to vote up the price of grain on the world market, to feed to our imprisoned cows, pigs, and chickens, and go to the store and buy meat, dairy products, and eggs. When we do that, we are making it impossible for people in less industrialized nations to afford that grain, and they're starving. And that hunger is not only a massive injustice, but it is well understood to be the driving force behind conflict and war, which cause even more problems. And the environmental devastation, it's the poorer countries of the world that get most of the environmental devastation caused by those of us in the wealthier countries. So really moving to a plant-based diet is an act of justice, not just to the animals and to wildlife and to ecosystems and future generations, but also to hungry people, and to reduce the war machine. We're going to have a war machine if we're going to have animal agriculture. As I said, the first word for war was the desire for cows. Animal agriculture and war go together, and they always have. But this is a terrible, devastating institution in terms of happiness for human beings and refugees and all of the problems of war. It goes on and on. I mean, it just keeps building from this. So moving to a plant-based diet is the foundation of bringing more health to our society. And also just remember that there's a whole army of workers who have to kill animals and impregnate them on rape racks and steal their babies and electroshock them. And we pay for them, and we're paying basically people to do work that brings out the worst in them. And these workers have the highest rates of work-related injuries, but also among the highest rates of suicide and drug addiction and alcoholism. So again, to understand that animal agriculture essentially is a web of trauma to ecosystems and to other people and to our society. And so when we eat that stuff, it's also traumatic to our body because it's constituted of so-called nutrients that are really hard for our body to deal with. That's a whole other conversation we can get into. But basically, that's our physical health. So what I've discovered, I've been a vegan now for 38 years, and I haven't been to a doctor, essentially, in 38 years. And I think in general, people who eat a healthy, organic, whole foods, plant-based diet, not only does the food become enormously delicious and much more environmentally sustainable, and creating a foundation for health in our environmentally, but also culturally and physically. But then the other two dimensions of health, besides physical, environmental, and cultural, are the internal dimensions of health. And those are psychological or emotional health, and finally, spiritual or ethical health. And I think this is where intuition comes in. The basic idea, just briefly, is that if I'm eating animal-based foods, I'm not just eating foods that are toxic physically in all these ways I've been talking about. I'm eating attitudes that are also quite toxic. The underlying attitudes in animal agriculture are, like you said earlier, disconnectedness. I'm not going to make the connection. I'm taught not to make the connection between what I'm eating and what it took to get it onto my plate. And so the ability to make connections is the definition of intelligence, essentially. Cultural intelligence as well as individual intelligence. And so being forced to sit down and eat animal-based foods, really we're being, unfortunately, dumbed down in our natural capacities of empathy and intelligence and awareness and wisdom are repressed. We're forced to see beings as objects. We're forced to just not look deeply, feel deeply, care deeply, listen deeply. And that shallowness makes it very easy for large institutions to exploit people. And we're much more likely to just believe the official stories, because animal agriculture is the official narrative. The basic subtext of every meal is just trust the authorities. Don't trust your own intuition. Don't trust your own feelings. Don't really look at what you're doing. Just go along like the emperor has no clothes. Just pretend that what you're eating is just chicken, right? Or it's just a hamburger. We're not eating cows or pigs. We're eating, that's such a lie. And it really reduces our intelligence. And so that basic understanding that the attitudes of disconnectedness, of commodification of life, of might makes right, of the domination of the feminine, the spirituality in many ways is about cultivating the sacred feminine dimension of life. I refer to this in the World Peace Diet as Sophia. Sophia is the ancient Greek goddess of wisdom, and I think there's a reason for that. Wisdom in all the traditions, whatever they are, I've noticed, I used to teach college courses in comparative religion, and wisdom is typically a feminine goddess, because it represents the inner capacity of us, whatever gender we are, to be receptive. Receptivity is the feminine, like in Chinese, there's the yin and the yang. Yin is receptivity, yang is action. And the basic idea is we can never be effective in our action if we can't be really truly receptive in yin, but animal agriculture is about just repressing this receptivity and just always be doing something all the time. So we have a whole society where in general, we're not peaceful. We're not comfortable with turning our attention within and listening, with being receptive, with looking deeply and trying to be aware of the consequences of our actions. This is all the sacred feminine. And also the sacred feminine is about caring and kindness. Like when a mother gives birth to a little baby, this feminine love, this unconditional love kicks in, and it's the foundation of everything. If we're not going to be healthy physically, psychologically, or in any way, if our mother ignores us after we're born, right? It doesn't care about us. We're going to die physically, and psychologically we'll be very damaged. So this is the foundation of everything. Of a healthy people, healthy society, healthy world is the loving, caring, giving nature of the feminine dimension. But what is animal agriculture? It's the opposite of that. Babies are always stolen from their mothers. When a mother cow or pig gives birth to a little baby, they want to love and protect and nurture and nurse that little baby. But in every case, whether it's an organic backyard operation or it's a big factory farm operation, it's not your baby. That's my baby. I own you. I own your baby. I'm going to steal your baby. I'm going to kill your baby. I'm going to impregnate you again. I'm going to steal your baby again. I mean, it's this massive violence, sexual abuse, and also the breaking down of the most precious sacred bond of the mother and the child. We do that millions of times a day. It's the foundation of our entire society. We have to understand we've been wounded by this. We've been born into it. We've been taught even not only to vote for it and make it happen, but to eat it. We, as little kids, we're eating this stuff. So our basic spirituality and ethics have been shut down. We're raised in a society of competition. And so what veganism is really is not veganism. It's ahimsa. It's coming back. It's an intuition. It's peace, liberation, freedom, but it's basically coming back to our true nature. And I agree with you, Daniel. I think that there is a time coming soon when we as caterpillars are going to become butterflies. I mean, we're going to we're in this outward eating kind of destroying, gobbling up the world, consuming everything mentality, and it's becoming obvious we cannot do this much longer. With nuclear weapons, with machines that can cut down rainforests an acre per second, overfish the oceans, it's time for us to turn within and reconnect with our purpose here and emerge as different beings. And I think some of us feel that calling, and just everything we can do to live this and understand this will give our life meaning. And we're really the ones, I think, that are essentially paving, I hate to use the word paving, but pioneering the way to a world where peace and freedom and justice and sustainability are actually possible, and they are possible. This earth is beautiful, it's abundant. There's nothing stopping us from a positive, beautiful future for ourselves and our children, except for one thing, really, which is this mentality of violence in our food and eating. This is our most intimate connection with nature and our world is food. We have got to get to the food. We got and our way of eating and relating. And so I think as we question that and bring that into harmony with our own inner wisdom, we create a whole other world. And imagining a vegan society actually is imagining a completely different world. And it's a beautiful thing to imagine, because I think as we move in that, as we transition in that direction, we'll see enormous healing forces unleashed. And we're already starting to see that, I think. The more we have community gardens and farmers markets and more energy self-sufficiency and more connection with the earth and more spiritual consciousness, more yoga and so forth, we're creating that world right now. And I think this is the most important thing to focus on, is this understanding this and then living it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you said it really well, Will. And part of where I get excitement these days is this may be a reach, and I don't know if anyone's thought about or talked about it. And you mentioned earlier when we were talking about, do we say anything to people about their food choices, and we don't want to blame or push them away, but like the Lorax said, I am the Lorax and I speak for the trees, and animals don't have voices that most humans are hearing. And right now, one of the exciting things happening culturally is this Me Too movement, right? Where so many women's voices that have been restrained or suppressed, repressed in the past are coming forward and saying, hold on now, it's time for, the truth to come out. And I'm hoping and seeing that, well, hey, this is, speciesism is just as real as sexism or racism or homophobia. And, soon we're coming to a Me Too in the voice of animals saying, hold on, me too. I want to have babies. I want to be happy. I want to live.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a powerful, very important point. Yeah.
Yeah. And hey, we're going to, I think we're going to wind down in a couple minutes. I want to also let people know two things. One is, if you have questions or comments, please toss them into the comments, say hello, and I'll be going through all of the comments. And also, if anyone wants to learn more about this kind of stuff and really make some powerful changes in your life, and for whatever reason you're not able or wanting to join us at Omega Institute for the full 4-week teacher training, I just created something brand new that I'm really excited about, which is a online learning institute, a spiritual mentorship membership where people can join on a monthly basis. And we've got an online community, a virtual community, which it's just, to me, so amazing that we have the technology allows us to connect in ways that we never could have before. And, I've been working with people one-on-one and in these in-person trainings, which is a big investment in time and money. And now I have the chance to work with people, where we do live group coaching calls, and I can put my information and learnings and lessons online. And there's just one more day to get the sort of early bird discount for that if anyone wants to. And last thing I'll say about it for now, anyone on the show who wants to join in, I will also give you a bonus one-to-one coaching session to kickstart it for you. And, well, as I see the time, there's so much that we could talk about here.
Right.
there's so much that's just
Yeah.
this conversation is so important. And I know that the crowd that we have here, the people watching the show, are already quite aware of and warm to this conversation. So I guess my last question or two questions here are, one, is there anything that I've missed asking you about, or anything that you want to share about this conversation or what's coming up for you? And two, for the people that are already hip to this conversation, that are maybe choosing to live a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle and aware of the consequences of their food, what else can they be doing that will, further our common cause here?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Daniel. And that sounds like a great thing you're doing with your membership group.
Hmm.
And I agree. It's so wonderful. We can get together beyond all national borders and so forth and create these communities. Yeah, the only thing that maybe I didn't have a chance to touch on is, I mean, there's many things really, but one of the things we just finished quite a few different lecture tours. One here in North America, a 2-month lecture tour to the southern part of the United States. And then before that, China, India, Europe. And then before that, some other worldwide tours over the last year or two. And just to really emphasize to everyone that this movement we're talking about, veganism, say, or vegetarianism as a spiritual and social movement, as well as for our own health, is an international movement that's booming in many countries. Seeing vegan restaurants in Dubai, in Cape Town, in all over Asia. I mean, China, it's huge. India, it's growing very quickly also. And I mean, there's a lot I could talk about that, but essentially to realize that this is probably I think anyway, the defining movement of our time, because it's bringing, as you said, the Me Too idea, to the most as inclusive as we can be, to include all beings, not only those of us who are women, but those of us who are cows, pigs, and chickens. That we also have interests, and that our interests are as important to us as humans. Our interests are as important to them. We're completely able to experience psychological and physical suffering, and the amount of abuse that we human beings are inflicting on other animals is so enormous, and it boomerangs back. And so I just want to really thank you for creating the space for this kind of conversation. If people are interested in knowing more about the World Peace Diet approach to living, we have a website, worldpeacediet.com, and Will Tuttle, my name.com. Music and art. I'm a musician, Mel's an artist. We try to essentially bring this message through beauty, through harmony, and also through, I guess, what you could call spiritual approaches, like with guided meditations, reading, to understand the interconnectedness of all life, and understand that, like the ancient spiritual teachings always said, that whatever we sow, we will reap ourselves. So it's wonderful to be kind and loving to animals just for that. That's really the main reason. But also realize that if we abuse animals and make them sick, we're going to be abused and we're going to be sick. If we let them be free, we'll be free. If we imprison them, we'll be imprisoned. If we enslave them, we'll be enslaved. If we, whatever we do, it comes back to us in this life or the next, right? So just really understand the bigger picture, that what we are, each one of us, is an expression of eternal consciousness. And that from that point of view, we can look with eyes of respect to all other expressions of eternal consciousness, and realize that we're all in this together, and that our happiness is interconnected. We've been born into a culture where in many ways our consciousness has been colonized by a force that is really not in our best interest, but we do have the power to question that, to question the values and actions and attitudes that we have internalized, and to transform those and to transform our behavior. And that when we do that, we become an example that can help others. So I think the whole thing is not so much to try to change other people, but really to change ourselves, and then let our changed self just be creatively engaged in sharing however we feel intuitively is the right way to share this message. And I think there's no one right way to do it. Each one of us has our own unique piece to the puzzle. So we're happy to work with anyone, and we have a training also, the World Peace Diet Facilitator Training, which you can find out about at our website. And we're happy to work with people and coordinate lectures. We travel anywhere, really, all over the United States and worldwide, and give lectures and workshops and things too. And there's just a fantastic network of people that are unified by this movement. And I think it's great to be part of something that is based on radical inclusion, like you're talking about, and based on an ancient wisdom traditions that also are in alignment with the most modern scientific understanding of everything. So there is really it's a one fundamental teaching that has to do with a deeper understanding of who we are, that we can each explore on our own and share with others.
Nicely said. Yeah, it's beautiful that we're making such great progress, and I'm really glad to hear what you're saying about other nations and cultures really embracing this movement, and super encouraging. And so, Will, thank you for being such a beautiful, non-judgmental voice, an inclusive voice with such experience and education, and really leading the way for this, and being the voice for the animals. And you wanted to say something else?
No, I appreciate what you're saying, Daniel, and I want to just thank everyone who's watching and listening, because I think if you're here and you're part of this message, and you can then turn your attention out into the world and speak up in whatever way it is. I think it's not so much to, like we've been saying, to blame other people or criticize them, but just to share the good news that I realize the only reason I've been eating animal foods is because I was just following orders. It's not in our best interest. I'm not doing it anymore, and it's fantastic. Just to understand what that means, and to free ourselves from the cultural narrative that's based on domination and exploitation and oppression, and create a new narrative based on inclusion and kindness. And that's the real health, is the spiritual health. From that, all the other kinds of health actually flow.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the subtitles for this show is how to break free from the matrix and master one's own life. And one of the most basic things is that choice of, well, what am I going to eat? And actually, what do I want to eat, rather than just what the model was that I was sold as a kid without thinking about it. So, exactly. Yeah, nicely said. And thank you again to Longevity Drops, our sponsor. Y'all, I hope you come over and join me for the membership mentorship. Your Vibrant Life Now, it's called, and our community is growing, a family of vibrant living. It's super exciting. And that's it for now. Next week, I'm very excited for next Wednesday. We're going to have Jenny Blake, author of Pivot. The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One, which is also about how to live your life in a way that's meaningful to you in terms of career and income and your mission on the planet. She's an amazing speaker, and we're lucky to have her next week. And until then, I am so grateful for y'all for being here. This has been the Art of Vibrant Living show. Your host, Daniel Aaron. Will, thanks again. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
All right. Great.
Bye. Bye.